Welcome villagers, to the village hidden in the stories. I am your guide, KAGE, the creator of all the what-ifs you see on this channel, with your suggestions of course. I hope you like the video we have today. Please comment video ideas, and subscribe if you're new. The video for today is What If Naruto Was Reincarnated as Slime Part 2. And if you can support me, please do so on my Patreon, where you can subscribe for $5 to get early updates, text what if transcripts, thumbnails, other arts, and gaming videos. The link will be in the description, so if you can, please help out. So without further ado, let's get into this what if. Part 2, New Village of Monsters. With a quick request to Great Beast/Sage, the two swiftly figured out how to suppress their auras, unknowingly putting most of the goblins outside at ease. The overwhelming pressure that had been suffocating the village dissipated instantly, and the goblins, who had been trembling moments before, now seemed able to breathe freely again. Raiga remained silent, letting Rimuru handle the conversation. She had already told him mentally that she wanted to play this off, and he saw no reason to interfere. It made sense. If they wanted to maintain their image as strong beings, it wouldn't do to let the goblins think they had been unintentionally leaking their aura like reckless fools. Rimuru let out a small hum, then shifted her tone into something more confident, though to Raiga, it was obvious she was still rattled by the revelation of their power. "Well, I gotta say, I'm pretty proud that you all noticed," she said, giving a light bounce. "Not many would have the courage to even speak to beings like us, let alone approach us so boldly." Raiga could practically feel the nervous energy underneath her words, but the goblins didn't seem to pick up on it. Instead, their eyes widened with awe, and murmurs spread among them. "So, it was a test," the blonde goblin muttered in realization. The elder nodded solemnly. Of course, such mighty beings would not simply lose control of their power. They must have been testing our resolve. Raiga barely stopped himself from snorting. That was definitely not what had happened, but he had to admit, it worked out in their favor. If the goblins thought they had been tested and had passed, their loyalty would only deepen. Rimuru, regaining a bit of her composure, gave a small nod. But let's get back on track." Her tone became more businesslike. "What exactly are you dealing with here?" The elder's expression darkened. "The ones who plague us are dire wolves. Ruthless, intelligent beasts that roam the forest in packs. Ever since our protector vanished, they have grown bold, attacking us night after night." The blonde goblin clenched his fists, his jaw tight with emotion. "We fought as best we could, but we lost so many." The elder closed his eyes, his grip on his staff tightening. "Among the fallen was my son and his brother." Rimuru stilled, and Raiga felt the atmosphere in the hut grow heavy. The elder took a slow breath, his voice steady despite the pain behind it. "He led our warriors in a desperate defense, trying to buy the villagers time to escape. But against their leader, he stood no chance." A tense silence settled over the room. Raiga studied the elder carefully. Despite his frail body, the goblin spirit had not broken. He carried his grief with dignity, using it to push forward rather than allowing it to crush him. Rimuru, no longer playing around, gave a small nod. "I see, that's rough." The elder met her gaze. "That is why we ask for your aid. If these attacks continue, our village will not survive." Rimuru hummed in thought before tilting her head slightly. "All right, let's say we help you. What exactly are you offering in return?" The elder didn't hesitate. "Our loyalty." Rimuru blinked. "Huh?" The elder bowed his head deeply. "If you save us, we will serve you. We have little in the way of resources, but we will offer our skills, our labor, and our unwavering devotion." The blonde goblin immediately followed suit, lowering his head in deep respect. "We swear it," our lives will be yours to command." Outside, the gathered goblins, who had been listening anxiously, seemed to catch on. One by one, they fell to their knees, their voices rising in unison. "Please, we beg of you, save us." Raiga exchanged a glance with Rimuru. The girl had been playing this as an opportunity to negotiate, but it seemed the goblins were already willing to give their everything in return. For a moment, Rimuru said nothing. Then, she let out an exaggerated sigh, crossing her metaphorical arms. "Geez, you guys are really putting me on the spot here." Raiga could tell she was still processing the weight of the situation, but he also knew there was no way she'd say no. But before Rimuru could respond, a chilling howl pierced the quiet evening air, its mournful sound echoing through the trees. The sharp, eerie cry was quickly followed by another, and then a third, each howl more menacing than the last. Soon, the forest surrounding the small goblin village was filled with the terrifying chorus of wolves, each one announcing its presence with a blood-curdling howl. Panic spread like wildfire through the village. The goblins huddled together, their eyes wide with fear as they looked to the elder for guidance. The elder and his son exchanged worried glances before quickly making their way to the entrance of the tent. They stepped outside, and the sight that met them confirmed their worst fears. "The dire wolves," one goblin shouted, his voice shaking with terror. "They're back, they're here to finish us off." Without hesitation, the elder held up a hand to calm his people. "Everyone, remain calm, we must not panic." But his words fell on deaf ears as chaos erupted. Goblins were scrambling, shouting in all directions. "They're going to eat the whole village," one shrieked in terror. "Where can we run?" another cried out in desperation. Raiga stepped outside the tent, and the scene before him was nothing short of chaos. Goblins were scattering in all directions, some desperately trying to find shelter, others cowering in fear. The sense of helplessness was palpable. Raiga turned to Rimuru, his eyes searching for any confirmation of her decision. She looked back at him, her expression showing a mix of determination and uncertainty. With a deep breath, Rimuru positioned herself next to Raiga. That was all the confirmation he needed. Raiga raised his voice, cutting through the panic. "Everyone, calm down." His tone was firm, commanding attention, and though his words were simple, there was an undeniable authority in them. For a moment, the goblins hesitated, unsure of what to make of the slime standing before them. Then, as Raiga continued to speak, their fear began to subside, if only slightly. "You have nothing to fear," Raiga continued, his voice unwavering. "Because we are going to defeat them." Rimuru, her voice calm and soothing, added, "We'll take care of the dire wolves, you'll be safe." Her words, gentle yet powerful, had an immediate effect. The panic that had gripped the village began to dissipate, and the goblins turned their gazes to the two slimes with a mix of hope and gratitude. The elder, still standing at the edge of the crowd, looked from the slimes to the goblins in awe. "So, you will help us?" His voice was filled with disbelief, but underneath it, there was a growing sense of relief. Rimuru and Raiga exchanged a brief glance, neither of them speaking just yet. They took in the faces of the goblins around them. Fear had gripped most of them when they first arrived. But now, after hearing their words, many had a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Raiga's voice broke the silence again. "Yes, we will help you. But know this, the dire wolves won't be an easy fight, we'll need to be ready." The elder, his heart swelling with both gratitude and determination, bowed deeply, his voice filled with sincerity. "We are your loyal servants," he said, his words carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "We will follow you, and we will do whatever it takes to repay your kindness." Rimuru smiled at the elder's pledge, her haughty demeanor softened by the sincerity in his words. "All right then, let's get ready, we'll deal with these wolves and make sure you're safe." Raiga nodded, his mind already shifting to the task at hand. The dire wolves were a challenge, but now, they weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting for the trust and loyalty of the goblins. With a final glance between the two slimes, the elder, and his people, Raiga turned toward the forest, the sound of the direwolves' howls still echoing in his ears. Some time quickly passed, and for some reason, the dire wolves had not yet attacked. It made sense though, they likely preferred the cover of night to hide their approach. Taking advantage of the time they had, the goblins and the two slimes quickly set to work, constructing a makeshift defensive barrier that would protect the villagers and allow the slimes to coordinate their efforts to the fullest. Under the calm of the night, with crickets chirping and a lone fire crackling, Raiga and Rimuru stood resolute before the sturdy wooden barricade, while the goblins took up positions behind it. Most of the goblins were armed with bows and arrows, though it was clear they were far from proficient marksmen. It was Raiga's idea to use this defense to mislead the wolves, convincing them that the two slimes posed little threat. Yet he had a more strategic plan in mind. He would personally confront the dire wolf leader, while Rimuru would engage one of its subordinates. This tactic served two purposes. First, it would instill fear and command respect among the dire wolves, and second, it would allow them to seize any extra abilities or insights the battle might offer for later use. As the night deepened, Raiga exchanged a determined glance with Rimuru, steadying himself for what was to come. Minutes later, the high-level monsters arrived. Even from a distance, Raiga could tell which one was the leader. Standing at the forefront was a massive dire wolf, its piercing gaze locked onto the village with an air of dominance. Beside him stood two others. The first was another dire wolf, slightly smaller but marked by an unusual star pattern across its fur. The second, however, wasn't a wolf at all, it was a two-tailed fox. That was strange, it didn't change anything, but it did make Raiga wonder what its place in all this was. Then, the leader let out a resounding howl, a signal for his subordinates to charge. The pack responded instantly, clawed paws tearing up the dirt as they surged toward the village, their howls echoing through the night. Raiga could see the smirk on the alpha's maw, he thought this would be easy. But as the wolves rushed forward, the goblins loosed their arrows. Not that they did much, the dire wolves were too fast, however, that wasn't the real attack. The true threat came from the near-invisible steel threads Rimuru had laced throughout the battlefield at Raiga's request. The first wave of wolves hit them head-on. Some stumbled, their bodies suddenly slashed and torn. Others charged in blindly and were instantly cut down. It wasn't enough to cripple the pack, but it was enough to make them hesitate. Raiga smirked at the sight, their numbers remained strong. But the psychological effect was just as valuable. The leader's smirk, on the other hand, was gone. His expression twisted into a snarl as he suddenly lunged forward, snapping his powerful jaws through the threads, tearing them apart in an instant. For the ones he couldn't physically break, he simply roared. The sheer force of his voice shattered them. The pack quickly followed his lead, pushing forward, their blood-stained fur ignored as they neared the village. But then, they stopped. They had noticed Raiga and Rimuru before, standing at the village entrance, but something had changed. Now, one of the slimes was no longer a slime. Raiga chuckled, stepping forward, chakra surging through his body. This was what he had been waiting for, a chance to use his transformation in battle. His body shifted, no longer a yellow blob but a fully humanoid form. His long blonde hair flowed behind him, and his eyes gleamed with red slits. His black and red cloak billowed in the wind. To the dire wolves, it was unsettling. To their leader, it was confusing. Raiga reached out, flicking one of the remaining steel threads with a smirk. Nice skill my friend has, right? His voice was calm. But each word made the wolves growl. The goblins behind him stared in awe. Even Rimuru seemed a bit impressed. The dire wolf leader narrowed his eyes. Raiga tilted his head. Come on, you can still talk this out. If you submit, no more of your pack has to die. Finally, the leader responded, his voice a deep, guttural growl. We will not submit, his fangs bared. The injuries to my pack are a small price to pay for their bellies to be full once I rip you apart, human. Raiga sighed, shaking his head. First off, technically, I'm not human. Secondly, his smirk returned, how about this? Just you and me. 1-on-1, if I win, you and your pack submit. If you win, I'll let you eat the goblins. A few goblins gasped in fear, but the elder remained composed, his trust in the slimes unwavering. The leader didn't answer immediately, but his pride was clear. He wasn't going to back down, he would take the challenge, even if it cost him his life. The direwolf leader let out a low growl, his eyes burning with challenge. His instincts screamed that this wasn't just any ordinary fight. Raiga was no mere human, no ordinary monster. And yet, his pride as a leader, as an alpha, refused to let him back down. After a moment, he gave his answer. I accept, his voice rumbled like thunder. But do not think for a second that I will lose. Raiga's smirk widened, that's the spirit. He rolled his shoulders, letting his chakra flare up slightly. I'd be disappointed if you didn't give me a real fight. The wolves behind their leader took a few steps back, giving them space. The goblins, though still nervous, watched intently. Rimuru crossed her arms, standing at ease but fully prepared to jump in if needed. Then, silence. The night air felt thick with tension, every eye locked onto the two figures standing apart from the battlefield. And then, the dire wolf leader moved first. In an instant, he became a blur, his massive form cutting through the air with terrifying speed. His claws gleamed with an eerie glow, energy coating them as he slashed at Raiga with enough force to split a boulder in half. Raiga barely tilted his head, dodging by the smallest margin. At the same time, he moved in, twisting his body and catching the wolf midair with a firm grip. The direwolf snarled, jaws snapping at his arm in retaliation, but Raiga tightened his hold, forcing its mouth shut with his bare hands. Then, with a flicker of strength, he slammed the beast into the ground. The earth cracked beneath the impact, dust and debris shooting into the air. But the leader wasn't finished. Snarling, he twisted his body and kicked off the ground, launching himself away just in time to avoid Raiga's follow-up strike. His escape was cut short when Raiga was already upon him, moving faster than expected. The wolf barely evaded a devastating punch, only for Raiga's fist to collide with a tree behind him. The massive trunk splintered and toppled with a deafening crash. Raiga blinked, momentarily glancing at his fist. That was way stronger than I expected, he thought mentally, as he began to focus on his hand. The goblins and wolves alike watched in stunned silence. Yeah, I need to refine this body's control, Raiga mentally sighed. I'm too used to my old strength. This new form is on a different level, especially if I was only trying to use 1% of my old strength. A growl brought him back to the fight. The dire wolf was already preparing to strike again. Raiga didn't give him the chance. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a green blob of liquid soaring through the air. Special skill, Mixture Element. The sticky substance was designed to ensnare his opponent, restricting movement. The dire wolf dodged on instinct, but Raiga was already predicting his next move. Another blob shot forward, cutting off his escape. The wolf hesitated, barely managing to avoid the second trap, but it was all Raiga needed to box him in. Raiga lunged, fist cocked back, only for the dire wolf to unleash a thunderous roar. The force of the sound pushed Raiga back slightly, giving the wolf just enough space to escape again. Raiga grinned, excitement flaring in his red-slit eyes. The dire wolf leader growled lowly, his breaths coming heavier now. His movements had become more sluggish, his stamina waning. Raiga could see it, the fight was already won. Still, he wanted to end it in style. The blonde blurred forward, effortlessly dodging the wolf's final desperate swipes and snapping jaws. The leader's attacks became more frantic, his strikes losing precision, until finally, Raiga delivered a swift, crushing kick to his side. The dire wolf was sent flying, he crashed through a tree, the impact sending wood splinters in every direction. Before he could hit the ground, a green blob shot out, pinning him to the remains of the broken trunk. Raiga approached, rolling his shoulders as he stretched his arms. "Damn, I'm way too rusty for this. That should have been over a lot faster." A deep, wounded growl was his only response. Raiga laughed lightly, the whisker marks on his face stretching with his smirk. He crouched slightly, his crimson gaze locking onto the wolf's. "So, guess that means you and your pack submit now, right?" The dire wolf's golden eyes still burned with defiance. "Never," he spat, "my pack will destroy you." Who? His words cut off in an instant. Raiga had already outstretched his hand, a bat seal glowing on his palm. A high-frequency sonic wave burst forth, crashing into the wolf's body, rattling his very bones. The leader twitched violently, his body unable to resist the overwhelming sound waves. His struggles weakened, until finally, he slumped forward, dead. Raiga exhaled, retracting his arm. A part of him had hoped the wolf would submit, but he was too stubborn. And in this world, stubbornness meant death. With a quick motion, his body reverted back to its true slime form. He turned toward the rest of the dire wolves, his crimson eyes sweeping over the pack. "So," he began, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "You all will listen to me and my friend now, correct?" Silence, then, as one, the dire wolves bowed. Raiga smirked before turning his gaze to the limp body of the defeated dire wolf leader. "Great beast, activate skill forge, let's see if there's anything useful here." The world around him shifted, his vision flooded with the swirling blue of magicules. The sheer brightness of it momentarily catching him off guard. He had almost forgotten how overwhelming it was when using this ability, but it was always worth it. Race skill and basic skill detected. Raiga raised an eyebrow, not exactly impressive, but it was still worth checking. There was always a chance he could adapt something to complement his ninja techniques. Race skill, connected minds, links the thoughts of a pack, allowing seamless communication, additional effects unknown. That could prove useful. It would eliminate the need for verbal commands in battle, allowing for faster coordination. However, before he got ahead of himself, he turned his attention to the basic skill. It was a simple earth element ability, not exactly his style, but elemental techniques were always valuable. Even if earth release wasn't his preference, he could still find a way to integrate it into his arsenal. As for connected minds, he figured it would be best utilized as a seal rather than a passive ability. A seal would allow him to regulate and possibly modify its functions, expanding its potential beyond mere telepathic communication. With that settled, the battle officially ended. And time passed quickly. Now, Raiga and Rimuru stood before their new followers, the goblin elder positioned beside them. A mass of goblins and dire wolves gathered before them, standing side by side, remarkably unbothered by the fact that just hours ago, they had been enemies. A war had nearly broken out between them, yet now they stood as one. Raiga sighed, the brightness of the morning only deepening his thoughts. The battle had gone far too easily. If not for the blessings of Veldora and the skills they had acquired, things could have ended very differently. Luck had been on their side, but luck wasn't something they could rely on forever. A sudden noise from Rimuru brought him back to the present. The blue slime cleared her throat, silencing the crowd with a simple gesture. On the surface, she looked composed, exuding confidence in her new leadership role. In reality, she was screaming at Raiga through their mental link. What the hell do we do? This was never supposed to turn out like this. Raiga didn't move, but he could practically feel the panic radiating off her. Sure, building a village sounded fun, but this is different. We stopped a war, and now our enemies are supposed to be our people? There's got to be some resentment still lingering between them. For the first time, Rimuru turned to Raiga, looking for answers. Raiga, however, just stood there, sweat dripping down his temple at her internal meltdown. Say something, weren't you training to be the leader of a village? What do we do? Raiga didn't answer right away. Technically speaking, he hadn't been training to be a leader. Sure, the Hokage was the village head, but his own training had always been focused on strength, not politics or governance. Leadership wasn't just about power. So, he gave the best answer he could. He shrugged. Rimuru's expression deadpanned, her translucent form somehow managing to twitch in frustration. We're doomed. Raiga let out a long sigh before shifting his gaze back to the gathered monsters. He took his time choosing his next words. No matter what, this wasn't something he could decide alone. I'm not the only leader here. His tone was calm, reassuring. It helped ease Rimuru's nerves, if only slightly. The yellow slime then turned to his companion, a small grin forming. You're overthinking this. If you actually look at them, they don't seem too worried about working together. Our presence alone is keeping them unified. Still, it wouldn't hurt to encourage a little more cooperation. I say we find a way to reinforce that bond, but I'm not exactly sure how. He trailed off sheepishly. Rimuru hummed in thought before glancing back at the gathered monsters. She took a deep breath, not that she needed to, but it helped steady her nerves. Since we have an even number of goblins and wolves, we could pair them up, one goblin, one wolf. That way, they'll have to work together and watch each other's backs. Raiga blinked before chuckling, wow, you sure you were just a desk worker in your past life? Rimuru gave a mental laugh before responding. Problem solving was part of the job, but don't get too comfortable. After we pair them up, we have a lot more to deal with. Raiga nodded internally, already noticing the deeper issues, mainly the goblins' poor living conditions. Well, you lead the way, I'll follow. I'm not exactly big on being a co-leader yet, haven't trained for it. Once the pairs were assigned, the goblins and wolves regrouped in front of Raiga and Rimuru. However, Raiga quickly noticed that two creatures remained unpaired, the son of the dire wolf leader and the two-tailed fox that had piqued his interest. Rimuru, not noticing Raiga's distraction, addressed the crowd. Now that that's done, we need to focus on the essentials: food, shelter, defenses, and training. Raiga stepped forward, adding, we'll need different groups working on each task. Rimuru and I will divide the workload. I'll focus on the defenses, as well as beginning training those of you who show promise in combat, developing different fighting styles based on your abilities. Rimuru turned to him in mild surprise, to which Raiga responded with a smirk. He was a shinobi, of course, he'd start rebuilding those skills here. Even if the monsters weren't suited for his ninja techniques, he could still teach them self-defense or find others to train them in different styles. Before moving forward, Rimuru suddenly paused, her gaze locking onto one of the goblins. A realization struck her. Wait, you guys don't have names, do you? The goblin elder nodded blankly. Rimuru turned back to the gathered monsters. Let's change that, it'll be much easier if you all have names. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Raiga raised an eyebrow, not seeing what the big deal was. It was just a name, after all. Then, one of the goblins hesitantly called out, "Are you sure?" Rimuru nodded without hesitation. In an instant, the silence shattered into uproarious cheers. Goblins and wolves alike celebrated wildly, further confusing Raiga. He glanced at Rimuru, who returned his look with the same uncertainty. Despite their confusion, the naming process began. At first, they put real thought into each name. The elder was named Rigurd, after his eldest son who had died protecting their people. His remaining son was named Rigger in honor of his late brother. But as the process dragged on, their creativity quickly deteriorated. Soon, they were just adding random syllables to gob or picking names based on whatever came to mind. Eventually, they moved on to the wolves and the lone fox. The goblin elder warned them about naming too many monsters, but neither of them saw any harm in it. They named the wolf leader's son Ranga. Then, Raiga took the lead in naming the fox, giving it the name of someone dear to him, someone he wished had been here with him. Kurama. But those were the last names they managed to give before their vision blurred, exhaustion finally catching up to them. They passed out on the spot. For 3 days, they drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of their surroundings. It wasn't until the 4th day, at the break of dawn, that they finally awoke, feeling completely revitalized. "Behold, we have recovered," Rimuru declared dramatically. Raiga let out a sigh, sweat dropping at his co-leader's theatrics. During their rest, they had learned an important lesson: naming monsters consumed a massive amount of magicules. Great Beast and Great Sage had even broken down exactly how much had been drained from them. The revelation left them wondering why no one had stopped them. Then again, considering the sheer excitement the goblins and wolves had shown, perhaps no one had thought to intervene. Before they could dwell on it further, a new voice called out, "It seems you're finally awake, Lord Rimuru, Lord Raiga." Both slimes turned toward the speaker, and were immediately taken aback. Standing before them was an almost gorgeous goblin woman, bowing respectfully. She wore the same tattered rags as the rest of the goblins, though they did little to conceal her figure. Light purple hair cascaded down her back, accentuating her curves as she bent forward. Raiga, involuntarily, felt heat rise to his face. When did goblins get this attractive? Rimuru, meanwhile, seemed somewhat irked by the sight of the unfamiliar goblin girl. Before either of them could ask anything, the goblin woman straightened and offered a small smile. "I will fetch the elder." With that, she turned and gracefully exited the tent. Rimuru was the first to break the silence. "That was weird." Raiga, still recovering, gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I didn't think there were any cute goblins in this village, but now I'm really curious about what happened while we were asleep." As he turned to his co-leader, he noticed Rimuru had a faint blush, accompanied by an unmistakable look of annoyance. A slime-like eyebrow lifted on Raiga's face. "What's her deal? We just woke up, why is she already irritated? You okay?" he asked, his questioning tone only making Rimuru sigh. "I'm fine," she muttered, looking away. Before either of them could press further, another figure made their presence known, causing both slimes to startle. A towering, insanely muscular goblin entered the tent, radiating an overwhelming aura of pride. The man flexed dramatically before them, his sculpted form gleaming under the light as he struck a pose. "Greetings, Lord Raiga, Lord Rimuru," he said confidently, smirking as he flexed his arms together. Rimuru flushed and immediately looked away. Raiga, however, just raised an eyebrow, trying to process what he was looking at. "Okay, I know for a fact you weren't here before," Raiga said bluntly. "Who are you, and who was that goblin girl that just left?" The muscular goblin laughed dismissively. "It's me, Lord Raiga." Something about his voice sounded familiar, then it clicked. "Goblin Elder, is that you?" Raiga asked, disbelief creeping into his tone. The goblin grinned, flexing once more. "Yes. It is I, Rigard." The two slimes' eyes widened in shock. In just 3 days, the frail, elderly goblin had transformed into a towering, muscular warrior. "Wait a second, weren't you an old man 3 days ago?" Rimuru shouted, her voice filled with disbelief. Rigard grinned, striking another dramatic pose. "Yes, I was once this village's old relic, but after receiving a name, I evolved. You see, when monsters are given names, they transform, growing stronger and taking on new forms." He gestured proudly at himself. "All those you have named have changed for the better, gaining new strength and abilities." Raiga couldn't help but smirk. This was huge. It meant the goblins and wolves had even greater potential now. Training them for combat would be much easier if they had the capability to develop new powers. It also explained his and Rimuru's own strength. Since they were named by Veldora, it was no wonder they were so powerful. No wonder the goblins had been so excited about receiving names. It was more than just an identity, it was power. And in exchange for some magicules, a fair trade. Just as Raiga was about to voice his thoughts, a thunderous boom shook the hut. Something burst through the walls, sending dust and debris flying. Smoke filled the air as the sound of multiple tails whipping around echoed through the tent. As the dust cleared, the two slimes were met with an awe-inspiring sight. A massive 9-tailed fox stood before them, its fur gleaming, 2 spiraling horns curving from its head. Beside it was an equally imposing wolf, its fur marked with a star-shaped symbol, a single twisting horn protruding from its temple. The sheer pressure radiating from both beasts made the slimes pause for a moment. And yet, Rigard didn't stop posing, even as wind from the wagging tails kicked up around him. "Master, you are awake," both beasts called out at once, only to immediately turn on each other, growling. The fox, whom Raiga could only assume was Kurama, snarled first. "Master Raiga is far more important, let that mutt worry about itself." The wolf let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "I scoff at you, brother. Master Rimuru is the one we should be concerned about, Raiga should be removed." Kurama bared his fangs. "Oh, I see how it is, Master Raiga defeated your father, so now you want revenge." The wolf's eyes narrowed. "Father was an arrogant fool. But Master Rimuru granted me, and my entire pack, a name. The Tempest Wolves serve Rimuru, not Raiga." Kurama's tail swayed. "Then brother, I believe our rivalry begins here. I've always wanted to lead a pack of my own, but father and I never found another like me." The wolf met his gaze evenly. "Then I wish you luck, my new rival." Raiga blinked. Okay, that was weird, but before he could fully process the conversation, the two creatures immediately turned their attention back to fussing over him and Rimuru, completely obliterating what remained of the hut in their excitement. After the dust settled, literally, the slime spent time with their newly evolved village. Their return was celebrated with cheers and joyous shouts. the monsters lifting them into the air as they moved through the village. As they observed each named monster, it became clear just how much had changed. Not long after, Raiga found himself alone with Kurama. He had asked to speak privately, while Rimuru had taken Ranga, the newly appointed leader of the Tempest Wolves, somewhere else. He had a lot to discuss with his new companion. Raiga sat on a rock near the edge of the village, watching as Kurama rested beside him. The massive fox lay curled up, his 9 tails flicking lazily behind him, golden eyes locked onto the yellow slime with quiet curiosity. He didn't speak, didn't move more than necessary, just observed. Raiga had been drawn to him from the start. During the battle, while the wolves fought in a pack, Kurama had been different. He wasn't reckless like the goblins, nor was he instinct-driven like the wolves. His movements were calculated, precise. Even when he didn't fight directly, he was always watching, always thinking. "You were the first one I noticed," Raiga finally said. Kurama's ears twitched, his gaze unwavering. "You weren't just attacking for the sake of it, you were waiting, watching. You think before you act." Kurama exhaled through his nose. "Instinct only takes you so far, if you don't adapt, you die." Raiga smirked. "Sounds like you've had a rough past." Kurama closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. "I wasn't born into a pack like the wolves. My mother was the last of an old bloodline, foxes that once ruled these forests before the wolves took over." His voice was even, but there was an unmistakable bitterness beneath it. "She tried to raise me in hiding, but we were always being hunted. In the end, she died buying me time to escape." Raiga didn't say anything, simply letting the fox continue. "I learned quickly that being alone meant being weak. I had no pack, no allies, just myself. The wolves saw me as a threat, an outsider. When I got stronger, I wanted to challenge their leader, the one you killed." His claws dug into the dirt slightly, but he was too strong. "So I waited, I watched." He turned his piercing gaze back to Raiga. "Then you arrived." Raiga chuckled. "And I killed him before you could." Kurama huffed, something like amusement flickering in his eyes. "Yes, you stole my revenge." Raiga tilted his head. "So, you mad about it?" Kurama shook his head. "No. Because when you gave me a name, for the first time, I felt like more than just a wandering beast." Raiga's smirk faded slightly as something unspoken passed between them. A creature born into expectations, forced to survive alone, carrying the weight of a past he never asked for. Sounded too familiar. Raiga exhaled, meeting Kurama's gaze. "You know, you don't have to be the last." Kurama's ears perked up. Raiga smirked. "If you want a pack of your own, why not start here?" Kurama blinked, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, a sharp-toothed grin spread across his face. "Heh, I think I like you, Master Raiga." Raiga scoffed. But he didn't deny the warmth in his chest. "Damn right you do." Kurama chuckled, stretching out his limbs before curling his tails around himself once more. "I never had anyone to follow before, but I'll follow you, if you're worthy of leading me." Raiga grinned. "Then let's see if I am." The slime sat in silence, watching as Kurama rested beside him, his tail slowly swaying with the breeze. The weight of their conversation still lingered in his mind, heavier than he expected. He hadn't planned on getting attached to any of the monsters here, not like this. Sure, he was going to train them, build them up, make sure they were strong enough to survive. But bonding, that wasn't something he thought he'd do. Yet here he was. Kurama's story struck a chord he didn't want to acknowledge. The way the fox had survived alone, carrying the burden of a bloodline he never asked for, it was painfully familiar. Raiga had never had a clan, never had a family in the way most shinobi did, but he knew what it was like to be expected to live up to a legacy. Even in this world, where he was no longer a shinobi, that weight hadn't disappeared. After a few days, the challenges began. Raiga and Rimuru had established 3 basic rules to ensure that the monsters wouldn't misuse their newfound strength to harm each other or others unless necessary. With that, the various groups for different tasks were formed. Rimuru managed to organize teams for gathering food, focusing on hunting for meat and foraging berries for the village. However, the team responsible for shelter and clothing ran into difficulties. This made Raiga consider using a crafting seal to create shelters, but Great Beast informed him that it wasn't possible, at least, not yet. However, it hinted that upgrading the skill might make it feasible, though neither he nor Great Beast knew how to accomplish that just yet. On Raiga's end, things were progressing smoothly. He successfully crafted basic weapons and tools, cut down trees, and stored materials for later use. He even used some of the lumber to build fortifications around the village, expanding their territory. The only setback was that, despite their power-ups, many goblins still struggled with cowardice. Fortunately, with Rigurd's help, Raiga identified the ones best suited for training, giving him 12 promising students who would become his elite warriors. Before gathering his students, he first held a session training goblins and wolves to fight in tandem. It was a simple but effective style that emphasized teamwork between man and beast. He hoped that once the rest of the goblins saw his students' progress, they'd be inspired to grow stronger as well. Still, he had to admit, not all monsters were meant for battle. Many had other useful skills, and he was fortunate to find even 12 out of the 100 that now lived in the village. Among his new students, the first was Gobta. Despite his goofy nature and unchanged appearance, Raiga saw immense potential within him using Skill Forge. Gobta had the greatest energy reserves among the goblins, hinting at hidden strength waiting to be unleashed. Next was Gobli, one of the 3 goblinas in his class. She ranked second in raw strength and displayed impressive learning ability. If Raiga truly aimed to reshape the shinobi world, she would no doubt be an S-rank ninja in this new land. Rigurd's second son, Rigor, was also among the chosen. While his energy wasn't as overwhelming as the others, he had natural leadership qualities, courage, and an affinity for control, traits Raiga valued highly. Then there was Sasuke, a goblin Raiga personally named. His reserved nature and hidden bonds with others reminded Raiga of his old comrade. Luckily, Sasuke wasn't too prideful to admit he wanted to grow stronger. Raiga just hoped to help him open up to others. Sakura was another named goblin, a goblina whose bright pink hair mirrored his old friend. However, that's where the similarities ended. Unlike the Sakura he once knew, this one wasn't a fangirl. She had no choice but to join the training because she lacked the skills to forage for food like the others. Gobten was the last goblina, named after Tenten due to her natural talent with tools. Raiga believed she had the potential to become one of the best weapon specialists in this world. However, she had a severe aversion to blood, likely stemming from her traumatic experience with the old dire wolves. This also explained her initial hostility toward her new wolf partner. The rest of his students consisted of the Tempest Wolves. While he hadn't given them individual names, they all went by Tempest, which was bound to get confusing. Regardless, they would be key in strengthening the village's defenses. Raiga scanned the faces of his students, feeling a sense of pride swell within him. Despite their inexperience, they had adapted to the shinobi basics surprisingly well. He could already see the potential paths each of them might take, some as skilled warriors, others as tacticians, and perhaps even a few as future leaders. "All right, my students," Raiga called out, his voice carrying authority and excitement. Right now, you're at the genin level of shinobi. It may seem low, but this is only the beginning. With continued training, you will become much stronger. In just a few days, you've learned how to handle shinobi weapons and understand the basics of what it means to be a ninja. He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Soon, we'll be diving deeper into your training, but before that, there will be a test. Consider it your first real challenge, be prepared. He paused, glancing around. Any questions? Gobta raised a hand almost immediately. What happens if we fail the test? Raiga smirked. Simple, you'll train even harder until you pass. A few of the goblins gulped, while the wolves only wagged their tails, seemingly excited by the prospect. Sasuke crossed his arms. What kind of test are we talking about? Raiga's smirk widened. You'll find out soon enough. That earned a mix of groans and murmurs, but Raiga could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready, or at least, they thought they were. But the moment Raiga finished speaking, murmurs turned into bickering. What if the test is unfair? Sakura huffed, arms crossed. Gobta scratched his head. I mean, as long as it's not too hard, we should be fine, right? Sasuke scoffed. That's a weak way of thinking, you should want the test to be hard. Gobli stepped forward, and what if someone isn't ready, are they just left behind? The argument quickly spread. Gobten was muttering about how she wouldn't work with wolves, while Rigger and another goblin debated if they should spar each other beforehand. Even the wolves were getting involved, growling and snapping at each other over territory nonsense. Raiga sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This wasn't what he wanted. Sure, a little competition was good, but they were already dividing themselves. He thought he had been making progress, but maybe he was going about this all wrong. His thoughts drifted back to his time as a shinobi. No matter how strong a team was, if they didn't trust each other, they would never succeed. He had hoped they would naturally learn this through training. But maybe he had been too focused on turning them into warriors rather than comrades. Shaking his head, he let out a sharp whistle. Enough, the noise snapped everyone's attention back to him. He exhaled, glancing over them. This isn't going to work if you're already arguing over nothing. If you want to succeed, you need to start thinking as a team, not just as individuals. He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned and walked away. Training's done for today, think about what you really want out of this. Without another word, he left, making his way toward the village. Maybe Rimuru would have some advice, or at least, a distraction. Raiga found Rimuru easily, just in time to see yet another unstable structure collapse into a heap of wood and debris. Damn it, Rimuru yelled in frustration, completely unaware of Raiga's presence. He watched for a moment, debating whether to speak up, before finally stepping forward. You okay? The blue slime jumped slightly before letting out an exasperated sigh. Yeah, I'm fine, Rimuru muttered, looking down at the mess before glancing back at Raiga. Seeing his concerned expression, she sighed again. Really, I'm fine. It's just, these shelters aren't working, I have to admit, goblins just aren't meant to be builders. Raiga had figured as much. Even with their newfound strength, the goblins were still inexperienced. It was no different from his own struggles. His students were strong, but their teamwork was a mess. They had potential, but their lack of discipline made progress slow. If they couldn't work together, they wouldn't last in a real fight. Maybe they both needed a fresh approach. Or better yet, someone who could help them solve their problems. But as far as he knew, he and Rimuru were on their own out here. I get it, Raiga said sincerely. Things aren't exactly going how I'd like either. He paused, considering his next move. Should he push forward with his students or rethink his approach entirely? Then, an idea struck him. Maybe what they both needed was a change of pace. What if we switched, he suggested, turning to Rimuru with a smirk. I take a shot at fixing your problem, and you try handling mine. Rimuru blinked at him, tilting her body slightly in thought. You want me to deal with your students, you do realize I don't know the first thing about shinobi training. Right? Raiga smirked, and I don't know anything about building houses, but here we are. Rimuru let out a dry chuckle, fair point. She bounced slightly, as if shrugging, all right, deal, but don't come crying to me if you can't figure out the shelters. I won't, Raiga assured her. But don't be surprised if my students run circles around you. Rimuru laughed at that, though Raiga wasn't entirely joking. If nothing else, it would be interesting to see how she handled them. Maybe a different perspective was exactly what they all needed. With their swap settled, Raiga turned toward the collapsed shelters, rolling up his sleeves. He had no idea where to start, but he'd figure it out. That's what shinobi did, after all. At least that was what he told himself in the beginning. He was really out of his mind with the idea of a switch. He had no clue what he was doing, and it seemed like the Goblina would do a whole lot better without him, which still wouldn't make a stable shelter for anyone. After the massive fail of what was his first house, he quickly decided that they needed outside help. Luckily there had been a dwarf village not too far away from this area, to him anyway. He had learned this from Rigard, who gave him a map to find his way towards the dwarfs. He took Kurama and left to find the place, hoping that the village's skill would be enough to build some simple houses for their people. Honestly, he didn't know what he had been thinking. Shinobi were meant to fight, not build houses, and if his miserable attempt wasn't proof of that, he didn't know what was. Raiga found himself waiting in a slow-moving line leading into the dwarf village. He had left Kurama in the forest, knowing the massive fox had nowhere to hide and would only draw unnecessary attention. The line was filled with all sorts of beings, humans, monsters, lizard men, and even a stray cat, which seemed oddly out of place. Then again, he wasn't exactly one to judge. Considering he was currently in his slime form. He sighed to himself, boredom creeping in as the line barely moved an inch. He just wanted to get this over with, but at this rate, it felt like he'd be standing here all day. Just as he was about to step forward, a human suddenly cut in front of him. Hey, no cutting, Raiga said, keeping his voice calm despite the irritation seeping in. The man barely reacted. He glanced back with a blank expression before turning away as if Raiga wasn't even there. Raiga sighed, right, he was still in slime form. Hey, down here. I'm the slime you just cut in front of. This time, the human looked at him, though his expression remained completely uninterested. Wow, a talking slime, must be rare, the man muttered, more to himself than to Raiga. Raiga narrowed his eyes. There was no way this guy was thinking of selling him, was there? Come on, little guy, I'll take good care of you, the man added, pulling out a small knife. Raiga's irritation flared into full-blown anger. Without a word, he transformed, his body stretching and shifting until he stood in his human form, blonde hair swaying slightly in the wind. The sudden change silenced the crowd, and for the first time, the man seemed to realize he had made a mistake. I'll say this once, Raiga began, his blue eyes burning with annoyance. Leave me out of your get-rich-quick scheme. Sorry, not happening, the man sneered. You're even rarer now that I see you've got some power, and besides, he snapped his fingers, and 4 more figures stepped forward, forming a loose circle around Raiga. It's 5 against 1. Raiga took a quick glance at the newcomers, stereotypical adventurers. A swordsman, a rogue, a mage, and some kind of brawler. Before he could even respond, the first man lunged with his knife while the mage fired off a quick fireball from the side. Raiga dodged both attacks with ease, his whisker marks twitching slightly as a smirk crept onto his face. In one fluid motion, he caught the knife-wielding man's wrist, yanked him forward, and sent him flying with a powerful kick. The man crashed into one of his own teammates, both of them collapsing to the ground with a loud thud and pained groans. Raiga barely had time to enjoy the sight before another attacker rushed in. Unnoticed by the mage, the knife his teammate had dropped was now falling through the air. With precise timing, Raiga caught the blade mid-fall and slashed it across the approaching mage's chest. It wasn't deep enough to be lethal, but it sent the spellcaster flying backward, knocking him out cold. As the knife cracked and shattered in his grip, Raiga found himself momentarily captivated by the way the broken metal gleamed in the light. It was just reflective enough for him to catch sight of the next two attackers rushing him from behind. The swordsman and rogue came at him together, weapons raised. Without missing a beat, Raiga pivoted, grabbed them both by their collars, and slammed them into the ground. The impact was enough to knock them unconscious instantly. He exhaled, shaking his head. If this is what most humans are like, he muttered to himself, I'm glad Rimuru and I didn't make any rules about not killing them. Not that he needed to go that far, just a solid beating was enough to make them think twice. Raiga let out a sigh of relief, but before he could take a proper breath, a gruff voice called out. Stop right there. The blonde turned around to see a group of armored dwarves, their weapons at the ready. He frowned slightly, confused at first, before realizing they were looking directly at him with suspicion. Instead of making things worse, Raiga shifted back into his chakra slime form, his small body bouncing slightly as he landed. What's wrong? He asked, tilting his head. The dwarves didn't answer. Instead, two of them stepped forward, grabbed him without hesitation, and began carrying him toward the village gates. Raiga didn't struggle. He could easily break free, but he was curious where this was going. If he was in trouble for something, it was better to figure out why first. Apparently, it landed him in a cell. The cold stone walls and iron bars surrounded him, a single torch flickering dimly outside the room. Raiga sat in silence, waiting as a few guards stood nearby, their eyes fixed on him. After a few minutes, one of them finally spoke. You caused quite a commotion back there, slime. Raiga blinked. You mean defending myself? Attacking humans in our city isn't taken lightly, another guard grumbled. Raiga scoffed. Oh, right. So, I was supposed to let them kidnap and sell me? Makes perfect sense. The first guard narrowed his eyes. We don't have evidence of that. All we saw was you taking down 5 men in broad daylight. Raiga crossed his arms, his small slime body shifting slightly. You think I attacked them for fun? Maybe ask around before jumping to conclusions. Another guard huffed. Even if they did try to capture you, excessive force isn't tolerated here. Raiga's eye twitched. Excessive? They pulled a knife on me first. They barely had any weapons, one guard shot back. Raiga rolled his eyes. Yeah, because a knife, a sword, a mage casting fire, and a rogue trying to stab me in the back don't count as weapons. The captain of the guards stepped forward with a sigh. Regardless of what happened, you're an outsider, we can't just take your word over 5 wounded men. Raiga let out a bitter chuckle. So, because I actually know how to fight, I'm the bad guy? If I had let them win and they dragged me off in chains, would you be throwing them in a cell instead? The guards didn't answer right away, exchanging glances. One of them hesitated before muttering. That's not the point. Raiga scoffed. Sounds like it is. This whole thing screams, might makes right, only when it's convenient for you. The captain rubbed his temple, clearly growing frustrated. Look, slime, Raiga, he corrected sharply, I have a name. The captain exhaled slowly, Raiga, this isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about keeping order. You fought in the streets, and that's a problem, no matter the reason. Raiga sighed, finally looking away. He could tell arguing more wouldn't change anything. Fine, whatever. Before the conversation could continue, a dwarf suddenly rushed in, looking panicked. Captain, we've got trouble, the frontline soldiers are injured, badly, we need reinforcements and medical aid immediately. The captain straightened, how bad? We're losing men fast, we don't have enough potions to treat everyone. Raiga perked up at that, I can help with that. The guards turned to him with skeptical looks. What are you talking about? Raiga lifted one of his slimy arms, and in an instant, several glowing bottles appeared, neatly stacked beside him. Potions, he said simply, more than enough to get your guys back on their feet. The dwarf who had rushed in looked at the bottles in shock before quickly gathering them up. This will really help, thank you, he sprinted off without another word. Raiga smirked, see, I'm not such a bad guy. The captain crossed his arms, that doesn't mean you're free to go. Raiga sighed as he slumped against the stone wall of his cell, figures. The chakra slime leaned back against the cold stone wall of his cell, his thoughts a tangled mix of frustration and contemplation. He replayed the exchange with the guards over and over, wondering if all this fuss was really worth it. On one hand, he'd managed to save some soldiers with his potions and prove his strength. On the other, he was now locked up, an outsider in a land he hadn't chosen to be in. He considered his options. Should he try to force his way out of this situation? Or simply leave and continue on his own path? The thought of abandoning the goblins, of leaving these people to their own devices, stung, yet staying might only entangle him further in their conflicts. For a long moment, Raiga simply closed his eyes, weighing his own ambitions against the pull of responsibility. In the silence of the cell, he finally resolved that if his strength and skills were meant to be his path, he'd decide his own fate, either by breaking free from this place or by leading them to a better future. The question remained, should he leave or stay and fight for those who'd come to depend on him? For now, he wasn't sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at him as he awaited his next move. After a few more minutes someone finally came for Raiga. It had been the captain of the guards, and with almost too much kindness he was let free from his cell. He was freed because of the potions he had given to them. They had worked, and exceeded what the dwarfs expected from the slime, making the captain show as much gratitude as he could. The switch-up was somewhat confusing, but he guessed it made sense when he had indirectly healed the man's people. With that, he only asked to be taken to an architect that would either be able to teach his people, or build shelters for him. That's it for today. I hope you liked the video. Please like and subscribe, and comment ideas if you can, and maybe you could share this with your friends, because you never know, they might like what ifs too. So without further ado, all KAGE, out.